Start. Everybody, thank you all for taking time and coming in. It's wonderful to see you all. Thank you all so much for getting us all to this point of the year and a really successful year. This is really an opportunity to share a little bit about where we are in the year, how it's been going, some of our preliminary planning for the year ahead. And I just want to first say thank you for taking time out of very busy schedules for many more important hours than what we have scheduled here. So what I have done is shape for this talk a kind of overview of the school. It's really about me trying to find ways to share with you all some of the things I know about this wonderful school all around us that you all are a part of, and to shape that in a way that I think helps us all think together about where we're going, how we're going to get there, and what we're going to do. And it's hard not to want to start a talk like this by reminding us all of what we say about ourselves, and not just who we are, but what it is we do. And so it makes perfect sense for me to start with the obvious point around the long-standing mission of this school, to not just be a place that is about the educating of students and the pursuit of brilliant research and teaching and learning in our creative fields, but that there's a purpose behind that, and that purpose is, of course, the role that's going to play in transforming future lives. We have been saying that about ourselves for a very long time, and the vision that we're all working together to try and focus on in this school as we continue is, for me, in an initial set of questions around this unusual term that we have long used about this school, which is that word design, and what we mean when we use a word like design in a world like today. So in trying to frame a little story and sharing of information about the school today, I wanted to start there foremost, and to leap off of a mission statement and a statement, a vision for the school that really asks a question. And so one of the ideas I used to organize this presentation was the kind of thing that some of you will have heard me say to students all the time, which is, when you're working on a project, what's the question the project is trying to do work on? For me, that's one of those questions for us right now, and for where this school is in its own history. What is design in an age like ours, right? An age of absolutely unprecedented change, what is at times an unbelievable spectrum of technologies that are unfolding in front of us, and of course the growing reality of the unprecedented inequities that are being built by a world like ours. I think that is a profound question for our creative fields and disciplines. One way to answer that for me is in a vision we set for this school that places a focus on the ways in which our students and faculty and alumni all produce knowledge today, and not just the stuff like the room that we're sitting in this afternoon. We live in a world today that values, I think rightly, knowledge above all else. I think it is our capacity to produce knowledge in the peculiar way architects and their allied creative disciplines do that is in fact what explains our immense value to a university like USC today. We produce knowledge, and if we don't have faith that that knowledge will matter in the world going forward, it's hard to anticipate where we're going and why we're going to get there. I took a drive a couple of weeks ago out to see Case Study Adapt at the opening of the exhibition of the work of our students and some of our faculty. That was a follow-on event to the amazing one that we held here last fall, where 300 or 400 people tried to jam into this auditorium on a weird, rainy fall evening to celebrate this incredible effort that is underway to start to address the rebuilding, particularly on the Palisades side of Los Angeles. It was the first time I had taken a drive out there in the last year, and I have to say it was absolutely overwhelming emotionally to realize that the kind of event that had such an impact on so many people in that room here last fall, but also in this room today, and that so many of you are working on in different ways, is still a part of our world now, right? And it was the feeling that for me grounded this kind of a question to try and frame what I'm now going to present to you, which is a brief sort of state of the school. And I think it is a very real question today. And it isn't even for me a question of who is the architect in an age of the Anthropocene. It is, what is an architect? What is it that we can do that will not just address, but I would argue acknowledge the reality that that wasn't a natural series of events that played out 14 months ago here. That was a project and problem of design, fundamentally, that led to the kind of catastrophes that are still resonating from what played out in January of last year. I think it's a profound question. It's not my question, but it's one that I think gives me a way to start to frame, in a larger sense, some of the ways I've organized this much more prosaic presentation of information about us, the state of this school. I have acknowledging our audience of architects who almost always will want to organize things around space. I thought it would be maybe more interesting to try and organize this around time. So quick little snapshots where we've been since I last stood on this stage in my first state of the school, about a year and a half ago, actually. We've been delayed this year for any number of reasons to get to this point. I thought maybe it would be helpful to do an overview of that, of what we've all been doing together over the last year and a half. I'll speak briefly to where we are right now on the 6th of March in the 25-26 academic year, and then I'll finish with the part that I think we're all spending our days working on, which is where we're going to be going as a school. So just to jump right into it, where we've been. It's been a year absolutely of not just planning for the future, but also genuine action. I just wanted to remind everybody here, two big things sort of shaped the year in terms of external challenges that we've all been through to get to this point of 25-26. They're things that I think everybody here knows. They're things that we've also done actually quite a bit of work on. And I just wanted to share what some of that is. The other thing that we couldn't have quite imagined to the degree that we can understand it today is a truly unprecedented set of changes that are coming about and reforming higher education in the US right now. In profound, uncertain, and at times, I'd have to say, almost unbelievable ways. And I'll touch briefly on those. And then I just want to pair those with two internal priorities that we sort of set for organizing our work over the last year and a half that are very much our own, unlike some of the challenges that have been presented to us, and which really have to do with the ways in which we've been reinforcing the core academic programs at the school, but also shaping a long-term plan and vision for where the school itself is going to be going. So I thought this first part of the presentation is really just a brief recap of that for everybody to sort of see how we've gotten to where we are right now. So the challenges, if you can remember, the first one that I highlighted was one that is not unique to this school and a campus, and in fact not really unique to this campus, but which had to do with the financial challenges of where we are as a school. I tabled a budget last year that projected that we would be in deficit by about $2.4 million in fiscal year 25. Thanks to everybody in this room and across the school's hard work, we've actually done spectacularly good work on that. And I'll present that in just a second in terms of where we are right now. But I thought before doing that, I just wanted to share with everybody, for those of you that haven't seen this, some of the backstory for how this school got into that space. If you look at that graph on the left, looking at the kind of money we bring in as a school every year, the 21st century, you could say, has been pretty good to SOA at USC. You see a graph going up in terms of income that comes in. The challenge with the school has been an overlay of that with two other bars. First one is that upper blue line is simply that those dollars that were coming in and starting in the year 2000 to get us to 2025 just ain't worth what they used to, right? We have not, as a school, kept up in that most basic sort of macroeconomic definition of what we have in comparison to the world around us. The other part that is less known to this place than I think we've appreciated over the years is that lower line, which tells us how much of the dollars we generate every year actually end up in this room. That's the feature of USC that has changed dramatically over the last decade or so, especially. What those realities did was they combined to create a condition that I can show on that image on the right, which is beginning right at the moment this school, like everybody else in the world, rolled into COVID, meant that we suddenly didn't have the resources we used to do everything that we were doing and want to do. It's as simple as that as a story. You can see where those lines cross, and that red line simply charts that beginning in 2020, we just start spending more money than we take in every year. There's a way in which universities and schools like ours can traditionally manage that, which is you keep a pile of reserves that are available for what used to be called rainy days, even in a place like Southern California. Those things exist. I won't go into it in too much detail here, but just to say reserve funds are not assets that schools like ours have access to anymore at the university. So we, like all of our wonderful peer schools across campus, are in a space in which we simply need to be fiscally responsible around finances. It turns out, and I think everybody in this room has learned over the last several months especially, that we were hardly unique at USC for being in that situation. And in fact, the larger university, you could say, was in a more extreme situation than we were, which is the bigger headline news that we've been reading about over the last several months. What we share with the larger university, though, as a school, is an understanding that, in fact, we've got to correct that equation in some way. That's the reality that not just this university, but that we in the school face, that we need to find a way to shape a form for ourselves to do the kind of work we want to do that can be met with the resources that are available every year for us. And I just want in this first part to share a little bit of that background as we think together creatively for how we're going to do it. And we're going to do it, and we're going to do it well. And we're going to do it in a way that doesn't mean we're lopping off parts of the school going forward. There is a shared mission across different programs and disciplines here that is the strategic potential of this place going forward, but that needs to be done in a way that demonstrates we have an understanding of how we've actually also changed over the years. This, to me, is one of the most compelling features of this school. That over the last decade, or let's call it 15 years now, we have become a considerably smaller school than we used to be. 200 additional students, more students than could fit in this room, were a part of this school as full-time enrolled students back in 2012-13. I think some of you might not know, but largely that was the result of the fact that there was a global economy of international graduate students that were traveling the planet and landing in places like this that they don't as much anymore. In fact, they dramatically don't. And a little bit later in this talk, I'll share how that's changing even more over the next 12 months. But that's one way to explain how we ended up in the form that we did over the last few years. The only thing I learned in that exercise of mapping that was especially surprising was that, in fact, our undergraduate school had also gotten a fair bit smaller than it was historically for many decades. And that's something we're going to be correcting going forward, because we were purpose-built in our wonderful studio-based environment to have X number of people in studios that we don't right now. And we have the opportunity and a brilliant faculty to support. And with the university's blessing, which they've granted to us, we can get some of that critical mass back in the building. Anyways, just to get through this first arc of that sort of background, that longer term transition that was, by the way, wasn't unique to USC, and it's been a feature of global architectural education in schools around the world. We're a slightly more extreme form of that change than others, but really started to change a couple of years ago when, following the effects of a dramatic drop in about 2020, 2021 with COVID, our overall enrollment numbers in the school hit really what I imagine will be a low threshold for the 21st century of this school, and are slowly rebuilding. You can see there that 2023 was really the low point of that. We had about 600 full-time students in the school. And I'll come to where we are now in just a minute. Anyway, this background is really meant in part to provide a kind of overview to explain that financial situation, which is one of the big external challenges. Again, not unique to this school in the context of USC for sure, but which I think this sort of a chart can give us some sense of the challenge around. This is FY24, so this is going back 2 years and looking at a fiscal year in which we spent roughly 10% more than we had available to us, which campus made a very good effort to partially support in that year, but with a clear proviso that a set of guardrails would be put in place and we'll have to manage ourselves going forward. They've given us a window to do that. Here is that same situation, that same year highlighted here, that gray bar in the middle. There's FY25, $38 million taken in. I was projecting as we shaped that budget, which I was doing about 24 days after arriving here that February to present to the provost, we were looking at about a $2.4 million deficit for that year, roughly about 10% of our net income that year. Thanks to everybody's effort here, we closed out last year's financial situation way down on that projected deficit. And I know there was a lot of pain involved in that, and I think we always, in doing that, have to look really carefully at what the impact will be on courses and teaching. But like any project, that is the framework which you think through creatively and strategically all of the things that we want to do. The one feature that's sort of hard to see in all of those numbers that I just want to highlight for everybody here is that 2025 was the year, if you see that 19,512, 2025 is the first year in the history, 106-year history of this school, in which over half of our income never arrives here. 51% of the income we generate as a school now lives as a part of a larger university. And one of President Kim and campus leadership's project is to look really carefully at the ways in which that balance between local schools and larger central needs can be, let's say, better aligned with a university like this that has forever described itself as a school of schools, i.e., where the central unit is the school itself, not being dependent on a central entity. That was just a brief overview of that first big challenge that shaped the last year, and it was a real one that many of us have lived and worked on almost on a daily basis alongside all the great academic planning and curricular stuff. The other big challenge from last year had to do, if you remember what I was saying, the kind of unprecedented changes taking place in higher education in the US. And I don't think it's an overstatement to call these unprecedented. We are living through what amounts to a fundamental realignment of the federal government and American universities. For 70 years in the 1940s, what we call a modern university was a model that was invented by a few very clever people who had won a world war and believed profoundly in the role the government should play in funding the research activities of universities. 2025 has been a wake-up call to the reality that that model no longer exists. It is a political fight, and it is one I think many of us can continue to be a part of with a belief that that was a model that delivered extraordinary change and benefit to the world. But as we're all reckoning and working with on an almost daily basis, it is profound the ways in which things like research funding are changing across campus. I put up a little graphic here to simply remind everybody that first wave of impact on schools hasn't really affected us as a school in anything like the ways it is already realigning neighbors on at least two sides of us in this building, which have very large research portfolios funded by federal and other grant-making agencies, that have gone through organizational change to adapt to that, even in the first 12 months of that larger project. As you can see from us, it is literally a tiny sliver. What we classify as research in our revenue stream of this school is almost non-existent. We believe in what we have pursued is a research model that has lived largely at the level of individual faculty members, and we have an important role to play in supporting faculty members that have been dramatically and negatively impacted already in their own research. But it hasn't posed the kind of challenge institutionally that it certainly is in other schools already here and elsewhere throughout the United States. The other big 2025 challenge to this place that didn't affect us in the school the way it did some of our peers, even here on campus, is in the uncertainties around international enrollments. This year, this school has about a 20% international enrollment of students worldwide. We have 7,000 alumni, by the way, that live in 40 countries around the world. We are a global school. We want, need, and should be thinking of ourselves globally. The reality is international movement of graduate students, even before changes that are kicking in this summer, have dramatically changed that equation. I highlighted here just to give you a sense of why those changes wouldn't affect schools like ours. The number of international students in architecture and related arts fields is very, very small by comparison to other disciplines. And even though I think many of us in this room know schools like ours that have got a much larger enrollment of international students, particularly international graduate students, I've both directed and taught in schools of architecture that had between 75 and 85% international students. We are not in that kind of space. The fact is there are still a lot of uncertainties being created around all of that that have made it a real challenge for us over this last year. And I'll touch on some of the growing work around that for the year ahead in just a minute. So the other thing I highlighted in terms of forces that have shaped this year is really, this past year, is the work we're doing around supporting our academic programs, which in the larger sphere of where a school like ours has to become increasingly the focus of what we all do. We are defined by the work, the research, the teaching, the learning we do in these programs. That's the obvious reason for us to want to pay attention to those. It has meant we have had to make difficult decisions around things that don't sit in our core degree awarding programs over the last year. And they've been hard to do. There are some wonderful initiatives we were doing that were not being funded and supported in the way that our academic programs are, and in a way have had to return us to what I think is one of the great strategic assets of the school, which is that we have under one roof or one set of roofs 4 different important creative disciplines that have the potential to connect knowledge and experience across these fields in ways that really make teaching, learning, and research in a school like ours fundamentally different, and I would argue more valuable than places where there is only one of those squares in the remit of that school. The challenge in how we organize and operate ourselves is that the reality is this sort of imbalance between one of those disciplines and the other 3 that our academic programs sit in. If we make that chart looking at the numbers of students enrolled, numbers of courses being offered, we still see that kind of situation, and in fact live through it on a daily basis. One of the great strategic challenges going forward is to how to break through that, to actually strategically redefine ourselves with the breadth of that experience that exists in these different fields. And in fact, there's a fantastic and super interesting history to that kind of interdisciplinarity. emerging here
The opportunity
in the mid-20th century, which is one of the things that we can
Working
bring
in
back.
Los Angeles is a really interesting opportunity.
What USC does.
I only put 2 of the videos in thinking it would be less distracting, but it's like, yeah. But sorry, this slide is just meant to say that in addition to the hard work we're doing about reining in a budget and balancing expenditure with revenue, the point I wanted to make with this is just to highlight a few of the things that we're doing to also invest in those programs, right? Which has to be a driver going forward, right? That has to be our focus, and the kind of thing that can't be sacrificed to simply balance a budget, which is going to involve a lot of work, certainly in the years ahead, but is absolutely doable. And I don't have time to go through them in any great detail here, but there's a range of things that are happening across all of the programs that are really about getting the work of this school out in the world, such that it could never be confused as a school with its footprint. The work lives everywhere today in super interesting ways, and it prioritizes more than anything communication and the sharing of work as it's being produced, which I think we're doing an awfully lot of interesting, we have a lot of interesting fronts that we're trying to advance that work on that I'll get to in a minute. Just a final thing to mention about this first part of the talk, which is where have we been recently. A great deal of work over the last year has been about not just addressing immediate challenges, but laying out a longer term plan, right? Which many people in this room have played a part of. And what this year, if you look up at fall 25, amounted to a series of final consultation meetings with stakeholders that included students, faculty, staff, our alumni, our board of counselors. We met with the USC Architectural Guild. We used that to gather together the details of a plan, which I'll finish by presenting an overview to in just a minute, but which was really an opportunity for us to not just think about things we might want to be doing going forward, which is always super valuable to do, but to also do that amongst ourselves in a school in which in any one year is completely refreshed. And one of the reasons we deliberately stretched the timeline of that exercise out was to have the time for a school like this that hadn't gone through that kind of strategic planning exercise to allow it to roll across different kinds of experience and different groups of people that have contributed to what I think is going to be a really spectacular and not just strategic plan for where we're going to be going over the next decade. And again, I'll come to that plan in just a minute when I talk about where we're going. But just briefly, I wanted to say something about what students are always taking pictures of, which is where they are, which they just do instinctively, by the way. This selfie thing is just amazing. I've actually been in presentations with presenters taking selfies of their work and them in front of all of the critics. Like, it's just, you know, unending. And again, I thought rather than talk about where we are as a sort of geographic or spatial thing, which is an interesting and easy way to describe ourselves, the more interesting thing, again, might be to think about time. So March 6th is almost perfectly, in the mind of many people in this room, 3/4 of the way through an academic year, right? We've just tipped through week 8. We're week 8 of a 16-week block. Everybody thinks of an academic year like a foot race. From the left, we arrive with the balloons and the party in August. We race to Expo in May. And as I always find myself in talking to architects, the clocks just start spinning faster, right? Between now and May. It will be here next Tuesday. Like, it just will. And that's interesting for me, in part because it proves the point that time is a totally imaginary, made-up human thing. It's ours to take command of. I think you know, that's the thing to embrace when I'm always reassuring students. Like, it is a thing that you're inventing. It's not being imposed upon you, and we can figure that out. We will. The version of the diagram I wanted to share, though, is more about the school, which is that we live in 12 months a year cycles. And in fact, a huge amount of work takes place with many of the people in this room not being here. And I just want to, first of all, acknowledge the work of a staff, a brilliant staff, whether it's John and Antonio in facilities, Keiko and everybody in communications, Natalie, Liz, Pasha in advancement, everybody that's doing work outside of the 32 weeks of an academic year. So just to remember, this is a building that is occupied 32 weeks out of 52. Everything that's happening in those spaces between is, of course, also not just a moment to better prepare us for the core academic stuff, but also creatively a landscape for us to be thinking about and what we want to do. And I've just highlighted 2 or 3 things there, just for those of you that don't know, about 2 or 3 weeks after Expo closes and everybody flies home and goes home, this school will be across the street at the BMO Stadium at an annual USC Architectural Guild event that will bring together hundreds of people, as it did last year at the Ebel Theater in Mid-City, to celebrate not just architecture and where it is in the world today, but architecture alongside construction, development, planning, landscape, building, all sorts of things. At the same time, we will have groups of students in Maymester events in Asia, in Tokyo, Mexico City this year, and other places. And you know, as I live in schools of architecture, what interests me, and this is one photo I took of a portfolio of 300 photos in December after everybody left, of this place, which is the life of a school, right? It is, John and our facilities team, I promise you, it's like they could teach a course in magic for somehow bringing all of that back to what we're going to go upstairs after this. We've got thesis presentations in an hour that we've got to be up to. And I just want all of us to understand that when I show a map like this of what we call the stakeholders of our school, and you know, when I draw maps like this, that circle in the middle is always in the middle. The students in a school of architecture are the school of architecture. We're all here to ask the kind of questions and to not just support, but to provoke ideas that those 675 people this year will carry forward for the rest of this century. Kind of amazingly, there are people in that circle that will be working in this room and other rooms at the end of the 21st century, which is kind of hard to believe, but a great way to frame the question of what do you possibly teach people in 2026, right? But I just wanted to highlight for you, alongside students, key stakeholder group, obviously our amazing faculty, 126 people in our faculty this year. We have 28 staff members, but those circles that don't get seen as often, our board of counselors is an amazing international group of people that fly in and that we meet with regularly throughout the year to think about ways in which they can support us, not just in the obvious monetary sort of sense, but really in terms of the guidance and experience they can share from the outside looking in. We're always on the lookout for interesting people to add to that group. It's an amazing group that we were just with up in the desert a couple of weeks ago that will be meeting with us again next week ahead of a celebration that we'll have next Wednesday. And you can see the very vague outline of those 7,000 other stakeholders of this school that will be a focus for us going forward. The 7,000 people that were in these seats over the years that are now in 40 countries around the world. And that again, I think we've got a lot of work to do to reconnect to this school, but want to be a part of it in different ways. And it's a really interesting, creative question for schools like ours that have been around as long as they have. This is that school community seen a different way. If you don't like circles, here's the box version. The interesting thing in this version might be to see our staff sitting really as the foundation, those 28 people who sit in support of academic programs and our staff and students and do amazing things throughout the year, our faculty. And maybe the one point to make about the demographic version of this map that's interesting is we are a very rare school to have an interesting balance of 2/3 undergrads, 1/3 grad. It's a very good equilibrium to have a critical mass in both and a breadth of experience academically at the student level that creates an incredible landscape for teaching and learning. It's super interesting. I put this in just to remind us one of the most peculiar features of this year's version of USC architecture. We are 9% bigger this year than we were last year. We are the only school on this campus, weirdly, to have grown in 2025. In fact, the overall university is a fair bit smaller. Growth is not inherently a great thing, and rapid growth, one-year growth like that, can often create real problems. We do not have a plan to grow this school, nor do we need to. But we had an exceptionally positive set of enrollment results over the summer in our graduate programs, in MArch especially, but our grad program directors were really focused on those programs especially to start to bring them back. They were the ones that had changed really dramatically over the years, and it was a really terrific result. Those two numbers on the left that I highlighted from here are the kinds that we never really see in this school, which I find absolutely extraordinary, which is more first-generation students in this school than, for example, I had in a public university across town 3 years ago. Extraordinary feature of this school. That's one thing. The other is that when I did this diagram a few weeks ago for a presentation, I reckoned we were giving out this year to our students $10 million of support in total. In fact, it's closer to about 12 million from a meeting I was in yesterday, which is the combination of money that we give out as a school or that the university gives out to our students. This is an extraordinary thing that we go to the efforts that we do, even with all of that sort of dour, difficult discussion around budgets, to make sure that we do everything we can to support our students. And it's a project for us to just build on going forward. There's an incredible wealth of support out there for individuals, companies, and families of all kinds to realize students are in tremendous need today, and our job is to find a way to support them. This next slide is a sort of interesting version of our workforce that many of us never see. First of all, to remind everybody in this room that our biggest group of employees, are our students. We have 109 of them this year in the school, working across all of those programs. They're bigger than our pool of part-time faculty, which is quite amazing. Bigger in turn from our staff. The group that isn't here that I want to highlight at the end, and that I think is a real project for us going forward for being the size it is a full-time faculty that this year is a total of 30 amazing human beings that I would hope, as we look at the years ahead, will grow significantly in size. And this is one of the features you'll see in the strategic plan for the school, which is we need to address the fact that as a school, we have gone through a decade, an entire decade of not just no growth, but a reduction in the number of full-time faculty that we have here. We've made up for that in a brilliant way by hiring all kinds of brilliant part-time faculty that bring a wealth of experience and ideas, and they will always and should always be a part of a great school like this. But we need more full-time people. We need more lived experience in this building every day of the year. And the two faculty searches that we have on are just the glimmer beginning of that will build on the great experience we had in inviting Michelle to come join the school this year. She arrived in January, but it's really the beginning of a project that we'll be doing over the next decade, which we're in conversation and shaping plans for how that will happen. This is a neat little chart just to highlight why that need is there. It is hard to believe, but a reality that we deliver over 300 courses a year in this school. Like, that is a big portfolio of courses. And everybody here does a brilliant job about managing the realities around that, but it's a really powerful way to remind us that one of the most interesting features of this school is simply our breadth and scale. And again, I hope that's a strategic opportunity for us to think about how we're teaching and what we're teaching in the ways that we are. But it certainly highlights for me the need for us to really focus on faculty going forward. Just very briefly before moving into the final part here, advancement and engagement. It's been a very busy year here, and brilliant work that Natalie, Liz, and Pasha have done to reorganize and think about the question of what in some schools at USC is called advancement, in other places is called development, in other places called fundraising. It's really an area that is built around the topic of engagement, which is why advancement overlaps with so many other things that happen in a school of architecture. It's about engaging the world around us. And there's been a whole suite of things that have happened over the course of the last year that have been a really terrific next step in doing work on that. Wonderful events that are happening outside of this building that brings together friends, alums, and others from not just Southern California, but elsewhere, to learn about the school and what we're doing. Us participating now for the first time in a long time in USC-wide events that bring together alums and others, which is a really excellent opportunity for everybody to be reminded we got a School of Architecture here at USC that everybody always seems thrilled to get to know. A couple of highlights in terms of what we've done. Certainly one of them has been it's been a wonderful and positive fundraising year and a year of real uncertainty. We've blown way past in the first 6 months of a financial year the kind of targets that were set annually for the place, in part because of the incredible generosity of some of our friends around us. I've mentioned here Victor Inez and Tom Safran's new endowed chair of the school, the first endowed chair to land here in about 30 years or so, I would reckon, in the school, that we're going to be celebrating just next week in Victor's party. And an endowment that we're currently negotiating right now that'll give us support to do things that I think will especially be able to focus on the lives of our students. But I just want to take a moment to thank Natalie and Liz and Pasha for all of their great work. And I think also for everybody to understand one of the challenges for us going forward is how it is we connect that kind of activity with our core academic activities. They're meeting regularly now with program directors, but need to do that also with faculty and to see the work of our students, which is the face of all of that work that they build these events around. They've been a terrific series of events in recent weeks and months around that kind of work and the work of our students. The Firm Fair that the USC Architectural Guild supports, a wonderful donor event that we did one evening last fall that put everybody at the top of the Coliseum and brought together not just current donors, but friends and alumni of all kinds. Again, the highlight being the opportunity they have to sit down and meet the wonderful students that are receiving scholarships and other awards. And the event last June at the Ebel Theater that we'll do a version of in another month or so. So I want to close out with where we are in thinking about going forward. We are at the tipping point now of shaping plans that will be delivered to the provost in less than a month for a budget that will shape our academic planning for the 26-27 year. There's one key external challenge. We'll continue with those two that I mentioned earlier that were around last year that have to do with changes in higher education and our financial challenges. Those carry forward and will be real next year. But the twist for the year ahead, for those of you that don't know, is that as of July 1st, the US government is cutting off entirely the funding they have provided for many years to graduate students in higher education. The direct loan program comes to an end thanks to a law that was signed by the president last August that will draw a line under the idea that the federal government should be supporting graduate students. And they're putting increasing limits on other programs that will support students. The news isn't entirely bad in that what it is going to do is motivate universities like USC to create other mechanisms for those students that can only get to schools like ours through loans. And we got to make every effort to reduce the amount that students would need to do that USC and others will create programs that provide a means for doing that. And work is already underway. It's just the reality is those kind of programs aren't going to be in place for this coming year. Continuing internal priority is the one that I think you all can expect, which is around our programs and courses. There are a series of priorities that I have shared with everybody to this point. I'm not going to go through them again. There are things that I've already been highlighting here that really touch on our need to focus on a core academic mission. We are a school defined by the teaching and learning we do. I still believe in that highlight there on the left about being ourselves, that one of the really interesting challenges for us is how we differentiate ourselves as a school from those around us. And I think that differentiation isn't a Southern California instinct that we just got to be different for the sake of difference. which is always sketchy, however much there's a trope for that. But because the reality is higher education and schools like ours are becoming increasingly alike and generic. That's the thing for all of us to resist and to fight in different ways, to create forms of differentiation that matter. That other priority on the left will continue to be the hardest one, which is how we go about creating space that can allow us all to come together in events like this and others in ways that we just can't right now. And I just wanted to highlight a few of those in a second, which I'll show you pictures of. There is a larger term plan that the last several weeks has been spent weeding down to something that we can now share and communicate broadly with not just our internal audience here, but the whole world. The one, to zoom in onto just one part of that plan for now, which is a bigger, longer term goal, that it contains the obvious ones that we know we've got to continue to work towards, which is to create things like naming gifts that would be game changers for not just our academic programs, but the entire larger school. Since some of you haven't seen this in a few months, just to remind you, it's a plan that's organized around 4 different very real priority areas or needs, things like innovation, engagement, etc. And across each of those areas, longer term goals, medium term 5-year strategic aims, and shorter term, what's called in this chart tactics, which are already starting to play out in planning we're doing for this in the next couple of academic years. You'll get a chance to see all of that as it goes live. You'll get communication and messages from me. I just wanted to close out by the sort of high-level summary, without going into all the detail, of what I heard and took from these consultation meetings we did in the fall, which for me really came down to thinking of a vision for a school that can genuinely engage and not just acknowledge the scale of change, the defining realities out there in the world. This school has got an incredibly interesting 100-year history of engaging the world around it. When that world starts changing the way ours is right now, it poses real challenges to us. What I find in things like strategic plans or school statements worldwide is an acknowledgement of problems, but not a demonstration of how they're actually engaging those realities. And that's what the 3 big takeaways for me are around that. And these are things that I heard in the conversation that have been taking place across the school. The first one is absolutely interesting and slightly weird, which is architecture is bigger than ever. What we call architecture is so big that a school like this rightly has forms of expertise and disciplinary knowledge in areas beyond architecture or different from architecture, but that creates a larger space of learning and exchange that I think, again, makes it incredibly interesting for us as a school to do work on. That expanded field that Southern California is an incredible center of is a very real thing here, where what architects do includes not just the sort of stuff that a luminary alum here might have sketched 25 or 30 years ago to great effect, but is now an expanded field of experience that alum acknowledged when he allowed this alum, not of this school, by the way, but my former school, whose initials will go unnamed, to do this sort of thing to. For those of you that weren't at this incredible performance a few years ago, Rafik Anadol closed downtown Los Angeles for a few nights during COVID to overlay on Frank Gehry's project the archival history of the LA Philharmonic. And as interesting a kind of entertainment kind of event was, I think the thing that I just wanted to share in trying to find one image to speak to this idea of an expanded field is that Rafik's work is being shaped by a convergence of design platforms that include not just the architects, but those that were managing the archive of materials that were generated, the animated curvilinear projections that he threw on a highly detailed virtual model of the building that completely merges media and architecture in a super interesting way. There are many other examples you could point to of that expanded field. But the point that to me is interesting is how an education and training in a school like this opens the door to so many other forms of creativity and design. Second takeaway coming out of the strategic planning exercise for sure is that we've got to acknowledge that the news is not all good in the world, right? And fold that into the kind of things we teach, the kind of things we work on, the kind of collaborators that we want to have in this building. It is absolutely the case right now that the convergence of an accelerated expansion of cities worldwide, the urbanization of our planet, which is not hesitating with all of the other forms of destruction out there, is happening alongside the explosion of new technologies that people in this room, some of us couldn't have imagined even a few years ago, and a simultaneous and total degradation of the natural world. And most importantly, that architects are a part of that reality. And it is not one to simply acknowledge and then carry on doing the work that we've done for so long. That's why I think these kind of projects that have emerged in the school in recent months are so interesting. They are grounded in the idea of doing work on both the effects and the realities of those kind of changes. This wonderful Shade LA competition that Bhavna organized and that we opened up not just to students of this school, but students across LA County. We had 300 entrants in a competition whose work we'll celebrate in an event in April for those of you that haven't seen the notice yet, that are doing work on the question of what it will mean to provide shade in 2028 for massive populations that could be potentially arriving in a city where it's too hot to stand in line before getting there. I'm going to skip past writings I've done on this topic. I've been doing a series of lectures around the world on what I at various times call a new realism, magical realism, new constructivism, the idea that we need to ground architectural education in the realities of the 21st century. That's what will actually animate our field, I think, going forward. I think it's time to get over the delirious celebration that somehow we live in a new network world that's inherently better than the world before it. Kind of moving in the opposite direction most days of the week. I think working past that exuberance to start to engage the realities and to acknowledge architecture's complicity in all of that is a super interesting thing that can allow a school to really have a purpose and a place in the world. It's a topic I've been writing about and lecturing on for many years. But one of the genius features of a school of architecture is what I like to think of as its forms of magical realism, its ability to imagine alternative futures. The point of doing that in a school of architecture isn't to get the future right. We almost never do that. Most architects are spectacularly bad at predicting the future. But what they do is they describe that future, they make images of it, they make projects for it, they do scholarship on the history of those kind of projects that can pull the world forward. That's the thing for us to redeem and recover in schools like this that I think is just super exciting right now in an otherwise terrifying moment of change and unpredictability. I'm going to close with the last big takeaway, which is really the experience of being in a room like this, which I think is a reminder, maybe because I did a season of talks at AI conferences from next door at Viterbi to the School of Cinema to MIT to any number of other institutions, all of who wants to talk about some magic technology that, by the way, nobody seems to really understand. And by the way, is also a technology that very often acts just like architects by not knowing the difference between fact and fiction in really interesting ways. For me, after that, the reminder was the really interesting feature of a school of architecture is precisely that we have a workspace for 675 students here to sit down at and to spend time together and to work in. And that's the feature of the school that I think we need to really find a way to amplify. And you'll see little ways we're trying to do that now. Maria and everybody's doing a terrific job to share things that are happening across the school in support of students, but also our faculty. The harder project is how we overcome some of our worst architectural habits, which is to think we're going to solve a problem by building something smarter, better next. This is, by the way, a close-up of one of my predecessors standing around with a couple of faculty members dropping a roof on Watt Hall that was going to solve the future, right? I really believe it the case that a school is more like a found object than a tabula rasa today. That is the difference between the 21st century and the 20th century in its terrible history architectural education, which was continuously clearing out the past to try and make way for the future. The work we need to do is absolutely around learning to value and understand the world we already have all around us and doing a better job at it with everything from its floors to its ceiling tiles to its courtyards and everything else. These are the kind of little diagrams I spend my evenings thinking about, because they're harder problems to solve than flyers on the wall, right? This we know, but as I've shared with our audience before, one of the peculiar features of giving a building to a group of architects for 50 years, that's how long we've had Watt Hall. It opened in May of 1974. One of the challenges with doing that by giving it to a group of architects is they will do exactly what we did. We will just build more walls. Like, we have filled an open floor plan building with nothing but partitions and dividers for 50 years. And the proof of that is this picture I took on Wednesday when I was at Vinayak's wonderful talk, his faculty talk. This is the only space in Watt Hall that is unprogrammed and available for people to come together and to listen to people present and talk about projects, right? It is almost unbelievably a kind of remnant in the center of Watt Hall of what it was once built to try and do, which is to create open floors of experience and exchange that I think is the guiding line for us to think about in terms of the kind of experiences we want to create going forward. I even drew a floor plan to share with everybody here of what that is. For those of you that know, Watt Hall is a 4-bay by 5-bay, 30 by 30 foot grid, really simple plan. That little open area of what we call, with a peculiar name, Lower Rosendon, is the last little piece of what used to be an open floor of exchange and movement that I would really like us to try and do work to bring back as a model that I think would probably have more impact than anything we could say in a curriculum and design. And we'll be doing some of this work in the years ahead, for sure. But it's really to create experiences like this. The space that we have available, we make use of in interesting ways without having to declare it for one function or another. And in the meantime, in getting to those kind of spaces, just to remind you, the other spaces we have available, please, everybody in this room, make use of them. It's a wonderful lineup of visitors, not just friends from nearby who will be in presenting their work and our faculty members, but visitors from across not just the US, but further afield that will be coming in to share work. That's the other kind of space that we have as an asset to work with. But I just want to encourage everybody, faculty, please encourage students to do that. Students, please realize some of your most unexpected moments in the life of a school will happen in something you sit down to watch in passing with someone you'd never heard of, who will share an idea that you wouldn't have thought of, that you'll take back to the studio and move in unexpected directions. It's a fantastic lineup for the next few weeks on that front. And to close, and maybe the piece that holds all of this together for me is that the way to navigate that landscape is really by returning to the question of how we teach and share values that matter most to us here. Right? Our faculty have done a wonderful job of sort of outlining a set of core principles and beliefs. And I would argue the way to navigate a world of change like this is to simply think of ways in which we can learn from one another, students, faculty, staff, everybody, learn from one another about what matters most and how that becomes the guiding light for you as you sort of navigate the world of change that's taking place all around us. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you, everybody.